There's a smell that fills a home with memory. It's not just the rosemary or the garlic rubbed into the meat. It's not even the way the butter melts into the potatoes, golden and slow. It's something deeper, something that says family, tradition, love. Margaret stood in her kitchen that Sunday afternoon, apron tied snug around her waist, humming softly to herself as she basted the roast one more time. The light through the window was warm, honey-colored, the kind that made everything look softer, kinder. Steam rose from the pot of gravy on the stove, rich and dark, and she stirred it with the wooden spoon her own mother had used decades before. She was 62 now. Her hands weren't as steady as they'd once been, and her back ached if she stood too long, but this she could still do. She could still cook a meal that made people feel at home, that made them feel seen, that told them, without words, that they mattered. The roast had been in the oven for hours, slow-cooked the way George liked it, the meat falling tender off the bone. The potatoes were roasted with olive oil in thyme, crispy on the outside, fluffy within. The carrots had been glazed with honey and butter, and the gravy? Oh, the gravy was thick and velvety, seasoned to perfection. This was her Sunday ritual. Ever since Daniel had gotten married 2 years ago, she'd invited him and Olivia over for dinner every other week. At first, it had been wonderful. Daniel would rave about the food, tell stories from his childhood, laugh at old family jokes. But lately, something had changed. "Smells good, Mom." Her son Daniel appeared in the doorway, tall and tired-looking in his weekend sweater. He smiled at her, and for a moment, everything felt right. That smile, the same one she'd seen on his face when he was 5 years old, standing on a stool beside her, helping her stir cookie batter. "Thank you, sweetheart," Margaret said, wiping her hands on her apron. "It'll be ready in about 20 minutes. Is Olivia?" "She's in the living room." Margaret's smile didn't falter, but something inside her chest tightened. Just a little. Just enough. Olivia. Her daughter-in-law had been part of the family for 2 years now, and Margaret had tried. God, how she tried to make her feel welcome, to make her feel loved, to build that bridge between them that mothers and daughter-in-laws are supposed to have. But there was always this distance, this coolness that Margaret couldn't quite name, couldn't quite touch. It wasn't outright hostility. Olivia was never rude, never openly disrespectful, but there was something in her eyes, something dismissive, something that made Margaret feel small, outdated, irrelevant. She wiped down the counter and walked toward the living room, drying her hands as she went, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in her bones. Olivia sat on the couch, phone in hand, scrolling with the kind of detached focus that made her seem a million miles away. She was beautiful, Margaret had to admit that. Sharp cheekbones, sleek dark hair that always looked salon perfect, a wardrobe that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Everything about her was polished, curated, intentional. And next to her, Margaret always felt plain. "Dinner's almost ready," Margaret said gently, her voice soft and hopeful. Olivia glanced up, her expression neutral, polite in the way strangers are polite. "Oh, Okay. A pause hung in the air, awkward, heavy. I hope you're hungry, Margaret added, trying to fill the silence with warmth. I made your favorite roast potatoes, the ones with the crispy edges and the... Yeah, I remember. Olivia's eyes flicked back to her phone, her thumb scrolling absently. Then, so quietly, Margaret almost didn't hear it. My mom's food has flavor, not nostalgia. The words landed like a slap. Margaret froze, her smile still fixed on her face, her hand still clutching the dish towel. For a moment, she wasn't sure she'd heard correctly. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe Olivia hadn't meant it the way it sounded. But the way Olivia's lips curved just slightly, just enough, told Margaret everything. She'd meant it. Daniel laughed from the kitchen, a nervous, forced sound that tried too hard to smooth things over. Come on, Liv. Mom's cooking is great. You know that. Olivia shrugged, her expression unbothered, almost bored. I'm just saying, there's a difference between cooking and remembering. Margaret felt her throat tighten, felt the heat rise in her cheeks. She forced herself to nod, to smile, to pretend the words hadn't landed like stones in her chest. Well, she said softly, her voice steady, even though her hands trembled. I'll just finish up. She turned and walked back to the kitchen, her steps measured, controlled. She wouldn't let them see. She wouldn't let Daniel see the hurt. She wouldn't let Olivia win, if that's what this was. A game, a test, a quiet, insidious war. She picked up the wooden spoon again and stirred the gravy, watching it swirl, thick and dark. The roast was perfect. The potatoes were golden. The table was set with care. But suddenly, it all felt inadequate, small, old-fashioned in the worst way. Behind her, she heard the soft chime of Olivia's phone, a message being sent. Margaret glanced over her shoulder, just briefly, just enough to see. Olivia was smirking. Not at her, not openly, but there was something in that expression, something sharp, something secretive, something satisfied that made Margaret's stomach twist with dread. The phone screen glowed in her hand as she typed something quickly, her thumbs flying across the keyboard. Then she hit send, and the smirk deepened. Margaret turned back to the stove, her heart beating just a little faster, her mind racing. Who was she texting? What was she saying? And why did it feel like the beginning of something terrible? The kitchen suddenly felt too warm, too small, too suffocating. But Margaret kept stirring, because that's what she did. That's what she'd always done. She kept going. Margaret had always believed that love was patient, that if you gave enough, cared enough, tried hard enough, people would see it. They'd feel it. They'd return it. That's what she'd been taught. That's what she'd lived by for 62 years. But lately, she wasn't so sure anymore. It had been 3 months since that Sunday dinner, and things hadn't gotten better. If anything, the tension had grown quieter, more insidious. It lived in the spaces between words, in the polite smiles that never quite warmed, in the leftovers Margaret brought over that somehow always ended up uneaten, forgotten in the back of the fridge or quietly discarded. She and George lived just 10 minutes away from Daniel and Olivia's house, a small ranch-style home they'd bought shortly after the wedding. Close enough to help if they needed anything, far enough to give them space, or at least that's what Margaret told herself.
"You're overthinking it," George said one evening as they sat at their own dinner table. He was a man of few words, steady and calm, the kind of husband who'd stood beside her for 40 years without complaint. He didn't offer advice often, but when he did, it was simple, practical, rooted in common sense. "I'm not overthinking it," Margaret murmured, pushing her mashed potatoes around her plate with her fork. I don't understand why she doesn't like me." "She likes you fine." "No, George, she tolerates me. There's a difference." He looked at her then, his gray eyes soft but firm. "Then let her. You can't make someone love you, Maggie. You know that." She did know that, but it didn't make it hurt any less. Her chest ached with it, that quiet, gnawing feeling of being unwanted, of being a burden, of being the mother-in-law everyone jokes about, the one who tries too hard, the one who doesn't know when to back off. But she had backed off. She'd given them space. She'd stopped calling as often, stopped dropping by unannounced. She'd waited for invitations instead of offering them. And still, it wasn't enough. A few days later, Margaret made chicken casserole, Daniel's favorite since he was 8 years old. She could still remember him sitting at the kitchen table, his legs swinging beneath the chair, his face lighting up when she set the dish in front of him. "This is the best thing in the world, Mom," he'd said, his mouth full, his eyes wide with joy. She'd made it 100 times since then, maybe more, for birthdays, for bad days, for celebrations. It was comfort in a dish. It was home. She parked in the driveway, grabbed the casserole, and walked up to the front door. Olivia answered after the second knock. She was dressed in yoga pants and an oversized sweater, her hair pulled into a sleek ponytail. She looked effortlessly beautiful, even in loungewear. Everything about her was polished, even when she wasn't trying. "Oh, hey, Margaret." "Hi, sweetheart. I made casserole. Thought you two might like it for dinner tonight." Margaret held out the dish, smiling hopefully. Olivia's smile was thin, polite, and completely devoid of warmth. "That's sweet, but we're actually eating light tonight. Trying to be healthier, you know." Margaret's hands tightened around the dish. "Oh, of course. Well, you can always freeze it for—" "Yeah, maybe." Olivia took the dish, glancing at it like it was an inconvenience rather than a gift. "Thanks." The door closed. Not slammed, just closed. Firmly. Finally. Margaret stood on the porch for a moment longer than she should have, staring at the wood grain of the door, feeling something cold and heavy settle in her chest. She walked back to her car slowly, got in, and sat there for a long moment before starting the engine. The drive home was silent. Later that night, Margaret stood at her kitchen window, washing the dinner dishes by hand. The warm water ran over her fingers, soothing and repetitive. George was in the living room watching the news. The house was quiet. And then, through the thin evening air, she heard it. Laughter. Olivia's voice, bright and sharp, talking on the phone. The window must have been open next door, or maybe sound just carried more than Margaret realized. But she heard it clearly. "I know, right? She still cooks like it's 1985. I swear, if I have to smile through one more casserole, I'm gonna lose it." More laughter. Whoever was on the other end was eating it up. Margaret froze. The dish in her hand slipped, clattering into the sink with a sharp, jarring sound. She stood there staring at her reflection in the dark window.
her face pale, her eyes wide, her mouth a tight, trembling line. She still cooks like it's 1985. The words echoed in her mind over and over, sharp and cold and humiliating. Margaret took a slow breath, then another. Her hands gripped the edge of the sink. And then, very carefully, very deliberately, she turned off the water, she dried her hands, and she walked away. George found her sitting in the living room an hour later, staring at nothing. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Margaret didn't answer right away. Finally, she looked at him, her eyes dry but distant. "No, I don't think I am." George sat down beside her, and together they sat in silence. Because sometimes there's nothing left to say. Margaret decided to try harder. Maybe that's what mothers do when they don't know what else to do. They bake, they smile, they extend themselves just a little further, hoping that this time, it'll be enough. That this time, the love will be returned. She spent an entire Saturday making Olivia's favorite dessert, lemon meringue pie. The kind with the tall, fluffy peaks and the tart filling that made your mouth pucker just right. It was a labor of love, separating eggs, whipping the meringue by hand until her arm ached, carefully toasting the peaks with a kitchen torch until they were golden brown. She'd asked Daniel weeks ago, casually, what Olivia's favorite dessert was. He'd mentioned the lemon meringue pie offhandedly, not thinking much of it. But Margaret had remembered. She brought it over on Sunday afternoon, her heart fluttering with something she didn't want to name. Hope, maybe, or desperation, or that terrible, aching need to be loved, to be accepted, to be enough. Olivia opened the door, her expression polite but distant, the way it always was. "I made you something," Margaret said, holding out the pie like an offering, like a peace treaty. Olivia blinked, surprised. "Oh, wow, that's really thoughtful. Lemon meringue. Daniel said it's your favorite." Olivia's smile faltered just for a second. "It was, when I was like 12. She took the pie, glancing at it with a faint, bemused smile. "But hey, it looks great. Thanks, Margaret." And then the door closed again. Margaret stood on the porch, her hands empty, her chest tight, the afternoon sun suddenly feeling too bright, too harsh. "It was, when I was 12. The words replayed in her mind as she walked back to the car. Past tense. Always past tense. The cracks kept forming. Little things, small moments that might have seemed insignificant to anyone else, but they added up, one by one, like drops of water slowly eroding stone. When Margaret complimented Olivia's new haircut, a sleek bob that must have cost a fortune, Olivia said, "Yeah, finally got someone who knows what they're doing." The implication was clear, unlike whoever cut Margaret's hair, unlike Margaret's outdated simple style. When Margaret tried to talk about Olivia's job, something in marketing, sleek and modern, involving social media strategies and brand engagement, Olivia responded with vague, dismissive answers and quick exits, as if the conversation bored her, as if Margaret couldn't possibly understand. When Margaret offered to help with the garden, she'd always loved gardening, had spent years cultivating roses and tomatoes and herbs. Olivia said, "We're actually hiring a professional landscaper, someone who knows the latest trends." Every kindness was met with a wall. Every effort deflected. Every attempt at connection dismissed. And Daniel, sweet, conflict-avoidant Daniel, either didn't notice or didn't want to. "She's just busy, Mom," he'd say whenever Margaret tried to bring it up. "She's got a lot on her plate. Work's been stressful." Margaret wanted to believe him. But the truth was harder to ignore now. Olivia didn't just not like her. Olivia looked down on her. "She's playing games with you."
Margaret sat across from her friend Nora at the small cafe downtown, stirring her tea slowly. The cafe was cozy, filled with the smell of fresh bread and coffee. Nora was 70, sharp as a tack and never one to mince words. She'd been Margaret's friend for 30 years, through thick and thin, through joy and heartbreak. "I don't think she's... Maggie, listen to me." Nora leaned forward, her voice low but fierce, her eyes blazing with protective anger. "That girl is playing status games. She sees you as old-fashioned, beneath you, and she's making sure you know it. She's putting you in your place." "But why?" Margaret's voice cracked, her hands trembling around the teacup. "What did I do?" "Nothing. That's the point. You don't need to do anything wrong for someone to decide they're better than you." Nora reached across the table, squeezing Margaret's hand tightly. "Some people just need someone to feel superior to. It makes them feel powerful, important." Margaret stared down at her tea, watching the steam rise. "Don't let her win by losing your grace," Nora said softly. "You're better than that. You're stronger than that." Margaret nodded, but inside she felt herself breaking, piece by piece. And then one Thursday evening, it happened. Margaret was scrolling through her phone, something she rarely did. She wasn't very good with technology, didn't understand half the apps Daniel had helped her install, but she'd been trying to stay connected, trying to be modern. A notification popped up, a tag from Jenny, the neighbor's daughter, a sweet girl in her 20s who sometimes helped Margaret with her computer. Curious, Margaret clicked it. The video loaded. It was a TikTok. The caption read, "When your MLI thinks salt is a personality." Margaret's heart sank. The video itself was blurry, shaky, filmed from across a room. But Margaret recognized it immediately. The floral wallpaper, the old wooden cabinets with the chipped paint, the counter where she'd baked 1,000 meals, where she'd taught Daniel to make cookies, where she'd rolled out dough for pies and bread and love. Her kitchen. And there, in the background, just visible through the doorway, was her. Just a glimpse, just enough. Enough for people to recognize her. Enough for the mockery to land. The comments were worse. "OMG, this is so relatable. Old people food hits different, LMO. Poor girl has to eat that every week. My MLI does the same thing. Send help." Margaret stared at the screen, her hands shaking, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She didn't cry. She just sat there. And something inside her, something warm and soft and hopeful, went very, very still. Cold. Hardened. Small towns have long memories. Margaret learned that the hard way. By the end of the week, it felt like everyone had seen the video, or at least everyone who mattered. The women at her bridge group exchanged glances when she walked in, pitying, uncomfortable glances that made her skin crawl. The cashier at the grocery store gave her a sympathetic smile, the kind you give someone who's been publicly humiliated.
Even Father Sullivan at church patted her hand after Sunday Mass and said, "Hang in there, Margaret. People forget these things." But they didn't forget. They whispered, and Margaret heard every word. George noticed too, though he didn't say much at first. That was his way. Quiet, steady, letting her process things in her own time. But one evening, as they sat at dinner, he finally spoke. "People are talking," he said quietly, his fork hovering over his plate. Margaret didn't look up from her mashed potatoes. "Let them talk." "Maggie, I said, let them talk, George." Her voice was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that comes right before a storm. George set down his fork, studying her carefully. This isn't you." "What isn't?" "This." He gestured vaguely. This shutting down." Margaret finally looked up, her eyes meeting his. They were dry, but there was something in them, something hard, something wounded, that made George's chest tighten. "What do you want me to do?" she asked softly. "Cry? Yell? Call her up and demand an apology?" He wanted her to let herself feel it. "I am feeling it." Her voice cracked, just slightly. "I feel it every day. Every time I walk into a room and people look at me like I'm a joke. Every time I think about that video. Every time I remember that my own daughter-in-law thinks I'm pathetic." George reached across the table, taking her hand. "You're not pathetic." "Then why does it feel like I am?" He had no answer for that. Daniel came over the next day, his face tight with guilt, his shoulders hunched like he was carrying the weight of the world. "Mom, I'm so sorry. Olivia didn't mean anything by it. She was just joking around with her friends. You know how social media is." Margaret set down her teacup carefully, her movements precise, controlled. "Joking. Yeah, you know how it is. People post stuff without thinking. It wasn't personal. She posted a video of me in my own kitchen, and she mocked it. How was that not personal? She didn't mock you. Then who did she mock? My cooking? My home? The food I made for you your entire life? The kitchen where I taught you to bake? Where we made Christmas cookies together? Where I held you when you cried?" Daniel flinched, his face crumpling. "Mom!" "Did you ask her to take it down?" He hesitated. That silence, that tiny, devastating pause was answer enough. Margaret stood, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. "I think you should go." "Mom, please." "I love you, Daniel. I love you more than anything in this world, but I need you to leave right now." He stood there for a moment longer, torn between loyalty to his mother and loyalty to his wife. And in that moment, Margaret saw the truth. He'd already made his choice. He left, and Margaret stood alone in her kitchen, staring at the same counter, the same stove, the same walls that had been turned into a punchline for the world to laugh at. Olivia didn't apologize. Instead, she doubled down. The next Sunday, she announced, cheerfully, brightly, like it was the best news in the world, that she'd be hosting dinner from now on, that it was time for something fresh, something modern, something that reflected their lifestyle. Daniel invited Margaret and George, but Margaret declined. "I'm tired," she said simply. It wasn't a lie. She was tired. Bone deep, soul deep tired. But the Sunday after that, Olivia's cheerful voice rang through the phone, bright and oblivious. "Hey, Margaret! Just wanted to let you know my parents are coming to visit next weekend. I'm planning a big dinner. You and George should totally come." Margaret's heart sank like a stone. "Oh, that's lovely. Yeah, I'm super excited. I'm doing this whole elevated farm-to-table thing. It's going to be amazing. I've been researching recipes all week." Margaret could hear the pride in her voice, the confidence, the barely concealed excitement at showing off. And underneath it, the unspoken message, loud and clear. "Watch me do it better. Watch me prove you're irrelevant." "Well," Margaret said quietly, her voice steady even as her heart broke, "I'm sure it'll be wonderful." "Thanks. Oh, and Margaret?" "Yes?" "Feel free to bring dessert. You know, something simple." The line went dead. Margaret sat in the silence of her living room, the phone still in her hand, the afternoon light streaming through the window. George looked at her from his chair, his newspaper forgotten. "You're not going." "I am." "Maggie, I'm going, George." Her voice was steady now, resolute, forged in fire. Because something had shifted inside her. She didn't want revenge. She didn't want to fight. She didn't want to humiliate Olivia the way she'd been humiliated. But she also wasn't going to disappear. She wasn't going to be erased. She was going to show up, and she was going to be herself. Margaret spent the week in a fog. She moved through her days on autopilot. Grocery shopping at the store where everyone still whispered, cleaning the house that suddenly felt too empty, answering phone calls from well-meaning friends who'd heard things and wanted to check in. She smiled. She nodded. She said all the right things. "I'm fine. It's just a silly video. Young people do these things." But at night, alone in the dark, she lay awake and stared at the ceiling, her mind replaying the words over and over. "Feel free to bring dessert." Something simple. The words played on repeat, each syllable sharper than the last, each repetition cutting deeper. It wasn't just the dismissal. It wasn't even the humiliation anymore. It was the erasure. The quiet, insidious message that Margaret's cooking, Margaret's love, didn't matter. That it was outdated, irrelevant, something to be tolerated at best, mocked at worst. George tried to talk her out of going. "You don't owe her anything," he said one evening, his voice gruff with frustration as they sat at dinner. "Let her have her fancy dinner. Let her show off for her parents. We'll stay home. We'll have a nice, quiet evening." "No." "Maggie," I said, "no, George." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. There was something in her tone, something final, something unbreakable that made George pause. He set down his fork, studying her carefully. "Then what are you planning?" Margaret didn't answer right away. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the old recipe box that had belonged to her mother. It was wooden, worn smooth by decades of use, the edges soft and faded. Inside were recipe cards written in her mother's careful handwriting, some yellowed with age, some stained with flour and butter, all of them precious. Slowly, deliberately, Margaret reached for it. She opened the box and began flipping through the cards, one by one, reading the familiar names: apple tart, chocolate cake, pecan pie, lemon bars. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. Cooking isn't about impressing people, Margaret. It's about loving them. I'm going to bring dessert, Margaret said quietly, her fingers tracing the edge of one card. George waited. And I'm going to remind them what real food tastes like. The night before the dinner, Daniel called. His voice was tentative, careful, like he was walking on eggshells. Mom, I just wanted to say thank you for coming. I know things have been weird lately, and I know Olivia hasn't been, well, I know, but it means a lot that you're still showing up. Margaret's throat tightened. It's fine, honey. It's not fine. I know that. He paused, and she could hear him swallow hard on the other end. Olivia, she doesn't mean to be hurtful. She's got this thing about proving herself, especially around her parents. They're kind of intense. I understand. Do you? Margaret closed her eyes, her hand gripping the phone tighter. I understand more than you think, Daniel. There was a long silence on the other end, heavy with unspoken words. I love you, Mom. I love you too, sweetheart. When she hung up, she sat in the quiet for a long time, the phone resting in her lap. Then she got up, tied on her apron, and started baking. Across town, Olivia was on the phone with her mother, pacing back and forth in her pristine kitchen. Yes, I've got everything planned out. It's going to be gorgeous. I'm talking microgreens, edible flowers, the whole aesthetic. I even rented special plates. Her mother's voice crackled through the speaker, warm but cautious. That sounds lovely, sweetheart. Will Margaret be there? Olivia rolled her eyes, stopping in front of the mirror to check her reflection. Yeah, Daniel insisted. You know how he is about his mom. Be nice, Olivia. I am nice, Mom. I even told her she could bring dessert. Olivia, Mom, relax. It's fine. She'll bring some ancient pie or whatever, and we'll all smile and pretend it's amazing. It's one night. I can handle one night. Her mother sighed on the other end, a sound full of worry. Just remember, family is complicated, and mothers-in-law are people too. I know. Olivia glanced at herself in the mirror, smoothing her hair, adjusting her necklace. Everything had to be perfect. Everything had to prove that she was sophisticated, successful, worthy. Trust me, I've got this under control. She hung up, her reflection staring back at her, confident, composed, victorious. But somewhere deep down, beneath the polish and the performance, there was a flicker of something else. Doubt, uneasiness, a tiny voice whispering, "What if it's not enough?" She pushed it away, turning back to her immaculate kitchen, her meticulously planned menu, her desperate need to prove she was more than just Daniel's wife. Tomorrow would be her triumph. She was sure of it. The next afternoon, Margaret pulled her apple tart from the oven. It was perfect. Golden crust, lattice top woven tight, the smell of cinnamon and brown sugar and butter filling the kitchen like a warm embrace. Steam rose from the vents in the crust, carrying with it memories of every holiday, every Sunday dinner,
every moment of love she'd poured into feeding her family. She'd made this recipe 100 times, maybe more. It was simple. It was honest. It was unpretentious. It was hers. George walked in, sniffing the air appreciatively, his eyes lighting up the way they always did when she baked. "Smells like heaven, Maggie." Margaret didn't smile. She just stared at the tart, her hands resting on the counter, her heart heavy with something she couldn't quite name. "What if it's not enough?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. George came up behind her, resting a hand on her shoulder, solid and steady. "It's always been enough, Maggie, and if they can't see that, if they can't taste the love in every bite, then that's their problem, not yours." She nodded slowly, but the knot in her chest didn't loosen. Because tomorrow, she'd walk into Olivia's perfect house with its perfect decorations and perfect food and perfect performance. And she'd bring something simple, something honest, something real. And she had no idea if it would matter. But she was going to try anyway. That evening, as the sun dipped low and golden light spilled across the kitchen floor, Margaret wrapped the tart carefully in foil, handling it like the precious thing it was. She stood there for a moment, looking around her kitchen one more time, the floral wallpaper that was out of style, the chipped countertop she'd always meant to replace, the wooden spoon hanging by the stove, worn smooth by years of use. This place had been her sanctuary for 40 years. And tomorrow, she'd walk into someone else's. But she wouldn't walk in empty-handed. And she wouldn't walk in ashamed. She'd walk in with her head high and her heart steady. Because she was Margaret. And that was enough. The house looked perfect. Margaret noticed it the moment George pulled into the driveway, his old sedan rumbling to a stop beneath the perfectly trimmed oak tree. The front porch had been decorated with tasteful autumn wreaths, the kind you buy from expensive boutiques, not craft stores. The windows glowed with soft, expensive lighting, not the warm yellow of regular bulbs, but something cooler, more modern. And through the glass, she could see the dining table, set like something out of a magazine spread. White linens, crisp and unwrinkled. Silver cutlery that gleamed. Candles in geometric holders, their flames dancing in perfect synchronization. It was beautiful. It was intimidating. It was cold. George parked the car and turned off the engine. For a moment, neither one of them moved. Margaret sat in the passenger seat, her hands clutching the foil-wrapped tart in her lap like a shield, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Ready?" George asked, his voice gentle. Margaret stared at the house, at the perfect windows and perfect porch and perfect everything. "No." He reached over and squeezed her hand, his touch warm and steady. "Then let's go anyway." She took a deep breath, nodded, and opened the door. Olivia answered on the first knock, as if she'd been waiting by the door. She looked stunning. There was no other word for it. She wore a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than Margaret's entire wardrobe, her hair swept into an effortless updo that probably took an hour to perfect, her makeup flawless. Everything about her screamed sophistication. "Margaret! George! Come in! Come in!" Her voice was bright, cheerful, performative in a way that made Margaret's stomach tighten.
She stepped inside, and the smell hit her immediately, or rather, the lack of smell. There was something faint and clinical hanging in the air. Herbs, maybe? Olive oil, maybe? A hint of lemon? But no warmth, no richness, no soul. Nothing that said home. Nothing that said welcome. Something smells nice, George offered politely, ever the gentleman. Olivia beamed, her smile wide and proud. Thanks! I've been working on it all day. It's a deconstructed roasted vegetable medley with tahini drizzle, microgreens, and edible flowers. Very farm to table. Very fresh. Margaret forced a smile, her hands still clutching the tart. Sounds lovely, dear. Oh, and you brought something. Olivia's eyes flicked to the tart in Margaret's hands, her expression brightening in that polite, dismissive way. How sweet! I'll just put that in the kitchen. She took the tart like it was an afterthought, something to deal with later, and disappeared through the doorway. Margaret stood in the entryway, her hands empty now, her heart heavy, feeling suddenly very small in this big, perfect house. Daniel appeared, pulling her into a hug that felt apologetic even without words. Hey, Mom. Hey, Dad. Thanks for coming. Of course, sweetheart, Margaret said softly, patting his back. Come meet Olivia's parents. They've been looking forward to this. He led them into the living room, and there they were. Richard was tall, silver-haired, distinguished-looking in a way that suggested old money in country clubs. But his eyes were kind, his handshake firm and genuine. Diane was elegant but warm, dressed simply in a navy cardigan and slacks, her smile reaching her eyes as she took Margaret's hand. It's so wonderful to finally meet you, Diane said, her voice genuine. Olivia's told us so much about you. Margaret tried not to wonder what exactly Olivia had said. She could imagine. She's sweet but old-fashioned. She means well. Her cooking is nostalgic? Likewise, Margaret said softly, smiling. They moved into the dining room, and Margaret took her seat at the far end of the table, away from the center, away from the conversation, away from the spotlight. Olivia floated around the table like a hostess from a cooking show, pouring wine with practiced precision, adjusting plates, narrating every detail of the meal like she was auditioning for a reality TV show. So this first course is a locally sourced beet puree paired with heirloom carrots and a touch of smoked paprika for depth. I really wanted to highlight the natural flavors of the vegetables without overpowering them. Richard nodded politely, his expression neutral. Diane smiled, her hands folded in her lap. But neither of them looked particularly impressed. The food arrived in stages, each course more artfully arranged than the last, small plates that looked more like modern art installations than meals. Everything was perfectly plated, perfectly seasoned, perfectly austere. Margaret took a small bite of the roasted vegetables. They were fine, competent, technically correct. But there was no warmth to them, no comfort, no soul. They tasted like something you'd eat at a trendy restaurant and forget about the next day. Across the table, Richard chewed slowly, his expression carefully neutral. He took a sip of wine, chewed some more. Diane picked at her plate delicately, smiling encouragingly at her daughter. Olivia watched them both like a hawk, her eyes darting between their faces, searching for approval, for validation, for the praise she so desperately needed. "So, what do you think?" she asked, her voice just a little too eager, a little too bright. "It's lovely, sweetheart," Diane said gently. "Very lovely," Richard echoed, setting down his fork. But there was something in his tone, something wistful, something absent, something unsatisfied. A pause hung in the air, heavy and awkward. Then Richard leaned back in his chair, wiping his mouth with his napkin, and said something that changed everything. He said slowly, his voice kind but honest, "Really, but I have to admit, I miss real food." Olivia's smile froze on her face. "What?" "Real food," he repeated, his tone gentle but firm. "You know, something cooked with heart, with flavor, with—" he gestured vaguely, searching for the word, "soul. Something that makes you feel like you're home." Olivia's face flushed, her hands tightening around her wineglass. "Dad, this is real food. It's elevated. It's modern. It's cold, honey." The table went silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Diane cleared her throat uncomfortably. "What your father means is—" "I know what he means," Olivia said tightly, her voice strained. Richard glanced around the table, his eyes searching, and they landed on something sitting on the kitchen counter, just visible through the doorway. A foil-wrapped shape. "What's that?" he asked, pointing. Olivia followed his gaze, her jaw tightening. "Oh, that's just—" "Margaret brought a tart." "A tart?" Diane's face lit up with genuine interest. "Homemade?" Margaret nodded, her voice quiet. "Yes, apple." Richard was already standing, his face brightening. "Could we try it?" Olivia's mouth opened, then closed. Her face was a mask of barely controlled frustration. We haven't even finished the main course. I still have 3 more." But Richard was already walking toward the kitchen, and Diane was right behind him, her face warm with anticipation. Olivia stood frozen by the table, her perfect dinner crumbling around her, her carefully constructed performance falling apart. And Margaret? Margaret just sat there, her heart pounding, not sure whether to feel vindicated or terrified. Margaret didn't move. She sat at the far end of the table, her hands folded in her lap, her heart hammering in her chest, as she watched Richard unwrap the foil from her tart. The smell hit the room immediately. Warm, sweet, rich with cinnamon and butter and brown sugar, and something indefinable, something that could only be called home. It filled the air like a memory, like a hug, like everything Olivia's perfect cold meal had lacked. Richard inhaled deeply, closing his eyes like a man who just found water in a desert. "Now that's what I'm talking about." Diane laughed softly, her hand flying to her chest. "Oh my God, that smells incredible!" Olivia stood frozen by the table, her face flushed, her hands clenched at her sides, watching her parents fawn over someone else's food, over Margaret's food, while her own carefully crafted meal sat forgotten on the table. Daniel glanced between his wife and his mother, his expression caught somewhere between guilt and relief and uncertainty. Richard cut into the tart with a knife, and the crust flaked perfectly under the blade, golden and buttery and honest. He served himself a generous slice, then handed one to Diane. "Margaret?" Diane asked gently, her voice warm. "Would you like some?" Margaret hesitated, then nodded. Just a small piece, please." George took one too, his eyes twinkling. And then, after a long, painful silence, Daniel reached for a plate.
"I'd like some too," he said quietly. Olivia didn't move. The first bite was magic. Not because it was fancy, not because it was complicated or elevated or modern, but because it was honest. The apples were tender, sweet and tart in perfect balance, cooked down until they melted on the tongue. The crust was buttery and flaky, dissolving into pure comfort. The cinnamon wrapped around every flavor like a warm blanket on a cold night. It was simple. It was real. It was love. Richard closed his eyes, chewing slowly, savoring every bite. When he opened them again, they were bright with emotion. "This," he said, his voice full of warmth and nostalgia, "is exactly what I needed. This is what food should taste like." Diane nodded enthusiastically, already taking another bite. "This is real cooking, Margaret. You can taste the care in every single bite. You can taste the love." Margaret's throat tightened, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. She hadn't expected this. Hadn't expected to be seen. Hadn't expected her simple, honest food to matter. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick. The conversation shifted after that, transforming the atmosphere completely. Suddenly, the table came alive. Richard and Diane started reminiscing about their own childhoods, about Sunday dinners and family recipes and the way their grandmothers had cooked. They talked about food that mattered, food that told stories, food that connected generations. "My grandmother made the best peach cobbler," Richard said, his face soft with memory. "She'd use peaches from her own tree, and the smell would fill the whole house. You'd know it was summer just from that smell." "My mother made bread every Saturday morning," Diane added, smiling. "The whole house would smell like yeast and warmth. We'd eat it hot with butter and honey." They asked Margaret about her own traditions, and she found herself answering, her voice soft but steady, talking about her mother's recipes, about teaching Daniel to bake, about the way food had always been her love language. For the first time all evening, she felt present, felt seen, felt like she mattered. George reached under the table and squeezed her hand, his eyes proud. Daniel smiled at her, really smiled, the way he used to when he was small and the world was simple and she was everything. And Olivia? Olivia's face was stone, her jaw tight, her eyes burning. "It's just sugar and nostalgia." The words cut through the warmth like a knife through butter. Everyone stopped. Everyone turned. Olivia stood at the head of the table, her arms crossed defensively, her voice sharp and bitter. "Anyone can bake something basic. It's not that impressive. It's just flour and sugar and following a recipe. It's not elevated. It's not sophisticated. It's just old." The room went deathly silent. Diane's smile faded, replaced by shock. "Olivia." "No, I'm serious." Olivia's voice cracked, raw emotion bleeding through. "Everyone's acting like this is some grand achievement, but it's just comfort food. It's nostalgic. It's what people ate 50 years ago because they didn't know any better." "Honest," Richard said quietly.
his voice cutting through her rant. Olivia stared at him, her face crumbling. "It's honest, Olivia," Richard repeated, his tone firm but sad. "And that's worth more than all the microgreens and edible flowers in the world. That's worth more than any trendy recipe or Instagram-worthy plate." Olivia's breath hitched, her eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall. "You don't understand," she said tightly, her voice shaking. "You never do. You don't understand what it's like to be compared to her all the time. To have Daniel talk about her cooking like it's sacred. To feel like I'll never be good enough." The truth hung in the air, raw and painful. Margaret's heart broke a little, understanding flooding through her. This had never been about the food. It had been about fear, about inadequacy, about a desperate need to prove herself worthy. But before Margaret could speak, before she could offer comfort or understanding, Olivia turned abruptly and walked out of the room. The sound of her footsteps echoed down the hallway. Then the bedroom door slammed. Margaret sat very still, staring at the empty doorway. She didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel vindicated. She just felt sad. Sad for Olivia. Sad for Daniel. Sad for all of them. Diane stood slowly, her face flushed with embarrassment and sorrow. "I'm so sorry, Margaret. I don't know what—" "It's all right," Margaret said softly, her voice gentle. But it wasn't all right. And everyone at the table knew it. Olivia stood in the bedroom, her back pressed against the closed door, her chest heaving with barely suppressed sobs. She wasn't crying. Not yet. But she was shaking. Her hands trembled as she pressed them against her face, trying to hold herself together, trying to keep the pieces from scattering everywhere. Why does she always have to be so perfect? The thought burned in her chest, hot and bitter and childish and true. It wasn't fair. None of it was fair. She'd worked so hard on this dinner. She'd planned every detail, every flavor profile, every visual element. She watched YouTube tutorials and read food blogs and practiced plating techniques until her hands cramped. She wanted to prove that she was capable, that she was sophisticated, that she belonged in this family, that she was more than just Daniel's wife. And somehow, Margaret had stolen it all with one stupid tart. One simple, old-fashioned, unsophisticated tart that everyone loved more than anything Olivia had made. A soft knock on the door. "Sweetheart." "I don't want to talk about it," Olivia said flatly, her voice muffled by her hands. The door opened anyway. Diane stepped inside, closing it gently behind her. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, her face a mixture of concern and disappointment.
"I said I don't want to talk," Olivia repeated, her voice breaking. "Then just listen," Diane said firmly. Olivia lowered her hands, her eyes red-rimmed, her face blotchy. Diane moved closer, her voice gentle but unwavering. "You're a brilliant woman, Olivia. You're talented, ambitious, successful. You have so much to be proud of. Then why—" "But tonight," Diane continued, her voice hardening slightly, "tonight you were cruel." The word landed like a slap. "I wasn't—" "You were,"
Diane interrupted. That woman has done nothing but try to love you, and you've treated her like she's beneath you, like her love doesn't matter because it's not modern enough, not sophisticated enough, not good enough. She's old-fashioned, Mom. She doesn't understand. Understand what? Diane's voice rose slightly. That you need to feel superior to someone? That you need to push other people down to feel good about yourself? Olivia's mouth opened, but no words came out. Diane softened slightly, reaching out to touch her daughter's arm. I know you're scared, honey. I know you feel like you have to prove yourself all the time. I know you're terrified of not being enough. Olivia's eyes filled with tears. But pushing other people down doesn't lift you up, Diane said softly. It just makes everyone smaller, including you. I just wanted to be good at something, Olivia whispered, her voice breaking. I wanted them to be proud of me. We are proud of you, but not when you're like this. Olivia turned away, her arms wrapped around herself, her shoulders shaking. She didn't do anything wrong, Diane said quietly. And deep down, you know that. In the dining room, the atmosphere was thick with tension and awkwardness. Richard sat with his arms folded, his expression somewhere between disappointment and frustration. He looked older suddenly, tired. Daniel looked like he wanted to disappear, his face pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table. And Margaret? Margaret just sat there, her hands folded in her lap, her face calm, but her heart breaking. George could see it. He always could. The way her fingers trembled slightly, the way her jaw was set just a little too tight. Maybe we should go, he said quietly, leaning toward her. No. Margaret. No, George, I'm not running away. Not this time. Richard cleared his throat, his voice heavy. Margaret, I want to apologize for my daughter, for this whole mess, for the way she's treated you. Margaret looked at him, her eyes steady. You don't need to apologize for her, Richard. She's a grown woman. She makes her own choices. I feel like I do. We raised her better than this. She's hurting, Margaret said softly. That doesn't excuse her behavior, but I understand it now. Richard nodded slowly, respect flickering in his eyes. A long pause hung in the air, heavy and uncertain. Then from the doorway, a voice. Trembling. Raw. I'm tired of pretending. Everyone turned. Olivia stood there, her face blotchy and tear-stained, her arms wrapped around herself defensively. I'm tired of pretending like your old ways matter, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. I'm tired of smiling through boring dinners and outdated recipes and acting like it's all so wonderful when it's not. When Daniel talks about your food like it's sacred. When everyone acts like you're this perfect mother and I'm just the outsider. Daniel stood abruptly. Liv, stop. No, I'm done pretending. She turned to Margaret, her eyes blazing with tears and years of resentment. You want to know the truth? Daniel doesn't even like your food. He just eats it because he feels guilty. Because you guilt him into it with your sad eyes and your perfect martyr act. The room went silent. Daniel's face went white. That's not true, he said quietly, his voice tight. Olivia laughed, a bitter, broken sound. Isn't it? You always talk about feeling obligated, about how she tries so hard and you can't disappoint her. That's not the same thing, Daniel said, his voice louder now, firmer. That's not what I meant, and you know it. He turned to his mother, his expression raw and desperate. Mom, I love your cooking. I always have. I love it because it reminds me of home, because it tastes like every good memory I have, because it's you. His voice cracked, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry that I didn't say that sooner, that I let her treat you like this, that I stood by and let you be hurt. Olivia stared at him, her face crumpling, realization dawning. Daniel, he said, I love you, Liv, but you're wrong, and this has to stop. Olivia's breath hitched, her whole body trembling. She looked around the room, at her parents' disappointed faces, at Daniel's hurt expression, at Margaret's quiet dignity. And suddenly, she felt very, very small, very young, very ashamed. She opened her mouth to speak, to apologize, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. So instead, she turned and ran. The front door slammed behind her, the sound echoing through the perfect house. Margaret sat very still, staring at the empty doorway, her heart heavy. Richard stood, running a hand through his silver hair. I should go talk to her. Diane nodded, her face etched with worry. We both should. They left quietly, murmuring apologies as they went. And then it was just Margaret, George, and Daniel. The silence stretched long and heavy, filled with everything that had been left unsaid for too long. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice breaking. Mom, It's all right, honey. It's not. His voice cracked completely. None of this is all right. I should have protected you. I should have stood up for you. I should have. You love her, Margaret said softly, understanding flooding through her. That's not wrong. But loving her doesn't mean letting her hurt you. No, Margaret agreed quietly. It doesn't. She reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. But it also doesn't mean giving up on her. Daniel looked at her, his eyes red-rimmed. How are you so kind, he whispered, after everything she said, after everything she did. Margaret smiled sadly. Because I remember what it's like to be young and scared and desperate to prove myself. And because, she paused, her throat tight. Because she's family now. And family means showing up, even when it's hard. Daniel pulled her into a hug, and she held him the way she had when he was small. When the world hurt him and all he needed was his mother's arms. I'm sorry, Mom, he whispered into her shoulder. I know, sweetheart. I know. The morning after felt like the aftermath of a war. Margaret woke early, the way she always did, and made coffee in the quiet stillness of her kitchen. The house was peaceful, the morning light soft and forgiving as it streamed through the windows. But the weight of the night before pressed heavy on her chest, a physical ache that wouldn't ease. George came downstairs, wordless as always, and poured himself a cup of coffee. They sat together at the kitchen table, the silence between them familiar and comfortable and sad. You okay? He asked finally, his voice rough with sleep. I don't know. He nodded, understanding everything she couldn't say. That was the gift of 40 years together. You didn't always need words. Around 10 in the morning, there was a knock at the door. Margaret opened it to find Daniel standing on the porch, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. He looked like he hadn't slept. "Hi, Mom." "Hi, sweetheart. Come in." He stepped inside, and she closed the door behind him, shutting out the world. They sat in the living room, the same room where she'd rocked him as a baby, where she'd helped him with homework and science projects, where she'd waited up for him on prom night, where she'd given him advice before his wedding. "I'm sorry, Mom," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion, "for all of it, for not standing up sooner, for letting her treat you that way, for being a coward." Margaret's throat tightened. "You love her. That's not cowardice." "It is when it means letting someone I love get hurt." He looked at her, his eyes full of guilt and grief. "I should have said something months ago. I should have stopped it." "You can't control her, Daniel." "I know, but I could have protected you." Margaret reached out, touching his cheek the way she had when he was small and the world was too big and frightening. "You're here now," she said softly. "That matters." He nodded, but she could see the pain in his eyes, the weight of knowing he'd failed her. "I won't let it happen again," he said, his voice firm with determination. "I promise you, Mom. Never again." Margaret smiled sadly. "Just love her and help her see that she doesn't have to fight everyone to matter." An hour later, there was another knock at the door. This time, it was Richard and Diane. They stood on the porch holding a bouquet of white roses and looking deeply, painfully uncomfortable, like people who'd discovered something terrible about someone they loved. "Margaret," Diane said softly, her voice thick. "May we come in?" Margaret stepped aside, welcoming them in despite everything. They sat in a living room, the flowers resting on the coffee table between them like a peace offering. "We wanted to apologize," Richard said, his voice heavy, "for Olivia, for the way she spoke to you, for everything." "You don't need to apologize for her," Margaret said gently. "We feel like we do." Diane's voice was tight with emotion, her hands twisting in her lap. "We raised her better than that, or at least we thought we did." Richard shook his head, looking older and more tired than he had the night before. "We knew she could be competitive, insecure, but we didn't realize how cruel she'd become." "She's not cruel," Margaret said quietly, surprising even herself. "She's scared." Diane looked up, tears in her eyes. "That doesn't excuse what she did." "No," Margaret agreed. "It doesn't, but it explains it." She took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Olivia is terrified of not being enough, of being ordinary, of being forgotten. And when she looks at me, she sees everything she's afraid of becoming, old-fashioned, irrelevant, invisible." Richard stared at her, his expression a mixture of sorrow and admiration. "You're very understanding. I'm just old enough to remember what it's like to be young and desperate to prove yourself." Diane wiped at her eyes. "We're going to talk to her, really talk to her, and we're going to make sure she understands that what she did was wrong." "Thank you," Margaret said softly. Richard cleared his throat, a small smile breaking through the sadness. "For what it's worth, that tart was the best thing I've eaten in years, maybe decades." Despite everything, Margaret smiled. Late that afternoon, as the sun began its descent and shadows grew long across the lawn, there was one more knock at the door. Margaret opened it slowly, her heart in her throat. Olivia stood on the porch. She looked small, fragile, broken. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her makeup long gone, her hair pulled into a messy bun. She wore jeans and an old sweatshirt, none of the polish or sophistication she usually armored herself with. In her hands, she held the empty pie dish, cleaned and returned. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was heavy with everything that had been said and everything that hadn't.
Then Olivia's voice, barely above a whisper, trembling and raw. "Could you teach me?" Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "Teach you?" Olivia nodded, tears spilling over and running down her cheeks unchecked. "How to cook? How to make something that feels like that makes people feel loved instead of impressed." She looked up, her eyes desperate and vulnerable. "I don't know how to do that. I only know how to perform, how to prove myself, how to make things look perfect, even when they're empty." Her voice broke completely. "Please, teach me how to be real." Margaret stared at her, at this young woman who'd hurt her so deeply, who'd mocked her and dismissed her and made her feel small. She could have said no. She could have closed the door. She could have held on to the hurt and let it fester into something permanent and unforgivable. But instead, she thought of her own mother, who taught her that love means showing up even when it's hard. She thought of Daniel and the family they were all trying to build together. She thought of the woman she wanted to be, not bitter, not vindictive, but kind, always kind. She stepped aside, opening the door wider. "Come in," she said softly. Olivia's face crumpled with relief and gratitude, and she stepped inside, clutching the pie dish like a lifeline. And Margaret closed the door behind her. 3 months later, the kitchen was warm again. It was a Saturday afternoon in late autumn, and the smell of cinnamon and apples filled the air, not from one tart this time, but from 2. Margaret stood at the counter, rolling out dough with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. Her hands moved with muscle memory, with love, with the knowledge that had been passed down through generations. Beside her, Olivia did the same. Her movements were slower, more careful, less confident, but they were steady, improving, real. "Like this?" Olivia asked, glancing over at Margaret's technique. Margaret leaned in, gently adjusting the angle of Olivia's rolling pin with patient hands. "A little more pressure on the left side. You want it even all the way across." Olivia nodded, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration, the way it did when she was really focused. It wasn't perfect. The dough was a little lumpy in places, a little uneven, but it was real. And that was everything. The first few weeks had been awkward. Painfully, excruciatingly awkward. Olivia came over once a week, always nervous, always a little defensive, her armor not quite dismantled yet. They'd started with simple things: chocolate chip cookies, banana muffins, basic sandwich bread. Margaret had been patient. Not because she'd forgiven everything immediately. Forgiveness, real forgiveness, takes time. But because she understood something now that she hadn't before. Olivia hadn't been cruel because she hated Margaret. She'd been cruel because she was terrified.
terrified of being compared and found wanting, terrified of being ordinary, terrified of being forgotten. And in Margaret, in her simple, honest, unpretentious way of loving through food, Olivia had seen everything she feared she could never be. It didn't excuse the cruelty, but it explained it. An understanding Margaret had learned long ago was the first step toward healing. "Okay," Margaret said, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron. "Now we crimp the edges. Watch carefully." She demonstrated, her fingers quick and sure, creating a decorative pattern along the rim of the crust. Olivia tried to copy her, fumbling at first, her fingers clumsy and uncertain. But then she found the rhythm, and slowly, carefully, the pattern emerged. "There you go," Margaret said, smiling with genuine warmth. "Beautiful." Olivia looked up, her face flushed with effort and something else, something softer, something hopeful. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion, "for not giving up on me, for this." Margaret paused, her hands stilling on the counter. "Your family," she said simply, as if it explained everything. And maybe it did. Olivia's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back, smiling instead. By the time the tarts came out of the oven, golden and fragrant and perfect, Daniel had arrived, bringing George with him. The four of them sat around Margaret's kitchen table, the same table where Daniel had eaten breakfast before school for 18 years, where Margaret had taught him to do homework and fold napkins and be kind. Now they sat together, plates in hand, the steaming tarts cooling in front of them. "All right," Daniel said, grinning mischievously. "Moment of truth. Let's see who's got the magic touch." Olivia laughed nervously, her hands fidgeting. "Mine's probably terrible. I'm still learning." "Only one way to find out," George said with a wink, cutting into her tart with a fork. He took a bite, chewed thoughtfully, then smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Not bad, kid, not bad at all." Olivia's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Really? You're not just being nice?" "George doesn't do just being nice," Daniel said, laughing. "If he says it's good, it's good." Margaret took a bite too, and her heart swelled with something warm and proud. It wasn't perfect. The crust was a little thick in places, the filling a touch too sweet, the lattice slightly uneven. But it was made with care, with effort, with love, and that was everything. Later, as the sun dipped low and the kitchen glowed with golden autumn light, Margaret stood at the sink washing dishes. Olivia came up beside her, dish towel in hand, drying in a comfortable silence. They worked together, their movements synchronized now after months of practice, the awkwardness slowly replaced by something that almost felt like friendship. Then Olivia spoke, her voice soft. "I'm sorry, Margaret, for everything, for the video, for the things I said, for making you feel small." Margaret glanced at her. "I know."
I was awful." "Yes," Margaret said gently but honestly. "You were." Olivia flinched but nodded, accepting the truth. "But you're here now," Margaret continued, her voice warm, "and that matters more than you know." Olivia's hand stilled on the towel, her voice breaking. "I don't know why I did it.
I felt like I had to prove something, that I had to be impressive and sophisticated and perfect. And you made it look so easy, so effortless. And I hated that. It's not effortless, Margaret said quietly, setting down a plate. It's just love. And love is never easy. Olivia wiped at her eyes, laughing wetly through her tears. I'm really bad at this, at being human. At cooking? Asked Margaret with a small smile. At everything. Margaret reached over, squeezing her hand gently. Then we'll practice. Together. And they did. Week after week, season after season, they practiced. Not just cooking, but kindness, patience, grace, forgiveness. Slowly, the walls came down. Slowly, trust was built. Slowly, something beautiful emerged from the ashes of what had been broken. In the end, we're all just trying to feed each other, with food or with love. And sometimes the simplest recipe is the hardest to learn: respect, humility, and the courage to start again. Because family isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up. It's about trying. It's about loving each other through the burnt crusts and the failed attempts and the messy, imperfect reality of being human. And sometimes the greatest gift we can give each other is patience. The patience to let people grow. The patience to let them learn. The patience to forgive. One meal at a time. Fade to black. The smell of cinnamon lingers in the air. Laughter echoes softly from the kitchen. And somewhere, in a warm and welcoming home, a family heals. One recipe, one moment, one act of love at a time.